Stories are the most powerful forces in the history of humanity. It is often said that they tie people to the same culture, same norms, and culture being the way of life of people. A story shapes the perception of everyone. So it takes one story to create one bond in the smallest basic unit, which is a family. Meningiti crater is the single largest surviving crater in the world. It towers the northern side of Nakuru, covering an area of 90 square kilometers and almost 2,500 square meters above the sea level. This crater holds several legends, myths, stories, and superstition. The most common one is held by the Maasai community, who believe that the openings on the ground of the crater are actually souls of the departed seeking to find their way in heaven. I meet Roy, who is a tour guide by profession and helps me navigate through the rocky terrain that has been the foundation of storytelling over the decades. As we go down the steep slopes of the crater, we notice a few women and a child passing through what looks like an opening that leads to a cave. Roy explains to me that these are women who hold their faith dearly to them and come to worship together. The caves of this crater have tied several communities to their heritage. The most common group of the past that benefited from these caves were the Mau Mau. It is here that they hid from their colonial masters and were given basic amenities by their families.
Jina langu naitwa Harun Mongai. Nimefanyika kuwa kiateka ama mtu ambaye ni msimamizi na mwangalizi wa mahali hapa panaitwa Meningiti Sacred Caves katika kitengo hiki inaitwa Jerusalem. Mahali ambapo utakapoingia ni mahali open, pako wazi, kuna miti kule ndani na ni mahali ambapo umetengwa. Hapa katikati kunaweza kunyesha mvua ama rasharasha, lakini kuna sehemu ambapo mvua haiwezi kufika, na ni mahali ambapo ombezi ama Wakristo ambao ni waumini wanapenda kuja kufanya maombi siku zao 2 ama 3, na mtu akiweza kama atakuwa na uwezo kustahimili baridi na aweze kuheshimu sheria zile ambazo zimewekwa. Na hapa tulipishi ada, lakini itakuwa ni vema sana unakuja na unakuwa umejipanga maji utakayoyatumia na jinsi utakavyoweza kujikinga kutokana na baridi. Kwa mfano unaweza kuja hapa utusaidie mwangalizi hapa kutafuta kuni na maji vile ambavyo unaweza kuyatumia maji yako vizuri, na tunaangalia hali usalama. Mahali hapa kunafagiliwa, hakuna kutupa ovyo taka ama na uchafu, na vile vile hapa tunaangalia upande wa nidhamu. Atakayekuja hapa kufanya maombi ama maombezi lazima awe tayari kuheshimu tourist ama wanaokuja kutembea, na awe tayari kuheshimu waombezi wengine, na awe tayari kuheshimu mtu yeyote yule atakayeingia hapa, na awe tayari kuheshimu pia watumishi wa Mungu atakao wakuta hapa ama watakuja kufanya maombi na maombezi kama jinsi yeye.
Na ningependa kukuuliza, umekuwa hapa kwa muda mgani?
Mimi nimekuwa hapa kwa muda wa mwaka 1 na miezi 8. Huu ni mwezi wa 8. Enzi za zamani kabisa, wakati wa Mau Mau walipokuwa wakifanya kupigana na mzungu, maana yake Mau Mau ni mzungu aende Ulaya, Mwafrika apate uhuru. Haya yalikuwa kama mahali pa handaki, mahali pa kujificha, wanakuwa na uta zao wapigane na yule mzungu, mikuki, mishale, wanajificha huku. Na hapa kwa sababu kuna hii migumo tree, kuna hii wale waliokuwa wakiitwa watu ambao wanafanya tambiko fulani na wanaomba miungu. Miungu walikuwa wakiamini miungu inakaa kwenye miti, migumo trees.
Okay.
Na kuna miungu ilikuwa kwenye mawe. Unaona? Sasa kuna ile dini inaitwa traditional religion. Zamani kabisa walifanya hivyo, lakini kwa sasa we are in the modern world, ama ulimwengu wa sasa, kuna ile the spread of Christianity. Unaona? Sasa watu wamekuwa sasa hawafanyi mambo kama yale yakuwa ya zamani, lakini wa sasa kuna, ingawa mambo kama hayo yalikuwepo, lakini kwa sasa pia kuna dini tofauti.
After my chat with Harun, I interact with more people to understand how oral storytelling has laid the foundation of their faith and belief systems. This woman in particular has been worshipping here for the past few days and believes that praying is an act that brings you closer to God. This natural setting clearly acts as a symbol that represents how a landscape can tie several groups to religious and cultural heritage. I head over to the capital and have a chat with Shiko Kihika, who gives me an expert opinion with regards to matters storytelling. What do you think about oral traditions and indigenous storytelling from where we are in the present?
Where we sit,
Yes.
I think we have ignored the passion and the kind of power our stories give us in terms of our political decisions, our social decisions, even in terms of communicating. Like storytelling was powerful because it was used to teach lessons. It was used to shape a certain conversation in the community. We no longer do that. We went to watch Netflix. We went
And
to
chill.
we lost that bit. That's why there's a very huge gap between generations right now.
Okay.
So I honestly think that we have ignored or put to rest a very important bit of our lives.
And since we're in the digital sector, in the digital era, do you think that we can tell these stories in a way that is still sticking to the fact that we want to tell these stories, but telling us more, giving us more information about this story without sticking to our roots that, we are tribes, we're living in this kind of tribes, creating that division of being tribal?
You know what? Digital space has no tribe. Like ask KOT, they will tell you when they're out there attacking, there's no specific tribe. And then sit back and look at our stories. Our history has no tribe. Our history is very general. Nobody says that, oh, a certain tribe fought for this, so they deserve this. So, where we are and where we sit, we are at an advantage. We can speak of our issues and go back to our history without necessarily tagging tribes along. We can use tribes for culture because we are rich, we are a diverse country. But unfortunately, we don't see that. So I think we are sitting at a potential um, super space, I would call it, where we can merge our history and our storytelling, the way it used to be told orally, and now the digital media, the digital way of doing it, which is quite powerful because this means there's a lot of documentation that needs to be done. This means that this is history that will never be lost. This can be archived for our future and for our future, our kids, their kids, and their grandchildren as they go. So it's a whole it's a whole thing that we must tap into. It's a huge space. It's diverse, and I think it's just an awesome space. Like honestly, yeah.
Okay, and storytelling in its own way ties people to their landscape, to their culture. But then the main challenge is record keeping. How do we keep these records and ensure that, if this is the Maasai community and they claim that they deserve to stay in the forest, then they're not supposed to be like taken away from there. So how do we ensure that we don't face this challenge of all this?
Storytelling does not tell us to mess up our environment. That is one thing. And if you go back in history and see even the communities that used to live in the forest, there's a bit that we are never told. But these communities, and even right now, look at their own gig. They literally take care of their spaces. They make sure that the indigenous plants, the Ongek believe so much in herbal medicines. Where do they get it from? From the forest. So they take care of these forests because they know the forests also take care of them. But impunity again. People want to grab land in forests. People want to cut trees and sell them. It's all corruption. It's all a system that is built on impunity that wants to shape communities in the bad image so that we look like communities are the people who are destroying. But imagine if we promoted culture the same way it was when our forefathers were there, knowing that if you live in such a land, it is your role to take care of it. And I think there's when we were growing up, and I think most of us found this thing where during Moi time, when you cut a tree, you're supposed to plant two. Then he left, and people started cutting thousands and thousands of trees without thinking that they needed to replant the same trees, you know. And I think it's a culture. It's systems that are set on impunity or that operate through impunity that then try to shift blames to the communities, which should not be the case.
Okay. And how can we conserve the history of these people without really, interfering with other spheres? Because sometimes when you interfere with, the government, talking about legislation, and you've mentioned the OGEC, they're facing the challenge of being told to like move away from the forest. How can we preserve the history and culture of these kind of people in such a way that it protects them and also it like makes them grow?
So how do we conserve it? We need to document it. We need to bring back history as it is. We need to make people understand that this is where we come from. And maybe we cannot do with our generation, but we have kids that are growing up that need to actually embrace their history. Because there's a thing with kids and what they hear and how it sticks that is just amazing because a kid learns to do because they're seeing or they're hearing. What a kid says first, the first words a kid says is what you people are speaking in the house. So if we can bring out, or rather create a culture that teaches our kids that this is our history, if we can go back to the villages and say, this village, this is where it came from, document, tell stories around the fire, bring the unison, like the Ubuntu spirit, then we are going to go back and create literally what Kenya needs to be.
I am here at the Bahati Forest Reserve, which is located 3.5 kilometers away from a small village called Kabatsi. It is actually believed that the Agikuyu community resided in this very place to support their young and made their men become men by storytelling. Storytelling is actually a big deal in this kind of forest because such a community, such as the Agikuyu, was able to tell people what was and what is. So men became men by hunting and gathering in this forest. And of course, women became women by collecting firewood.
that stories tie people to their landscape. Like, for example, we have the Meningiti crater where the Maasai used to reside, but due to some reasons they're not there today. And we also have the Mau forest where the Ogiek community used to live. So do you think that it is actually true that stories tie people to their landscape?
Stories tie people to the landscape, and as you rightly pointed out, Nakuru, for example, where we are, according to the Maasai, the word Nakuru means a place of dust. Naivasha used to be called Naiposha. When we try and maybe do oral history, we find that this issue about certain communities who came later to occupy the land need to realize that maybe they are fourth, fifth generation occupying that particular space. So when we do the oral history, we find that due to the nomadic nature, for example, of the Maasai, they traversed the bigger part of Rift Valley. For example, in Washiningishu is a Maasai word, but we don't have Maasais in Washiningishu. We have a bigger part of Laikipia where the Maasais and the Samburus, some of them, the Samburus are there. And that part was originally owned by the Maasais and the Samburus. So when we try to look back, this is something that we can say it ties us to some historical umbilical with certain spaces. So if the stories are not documented, at least when we go and approach people who are elderly, who live in certain spaces, these people can be able to tell us what the actual situation. They can be able to tell us what happened before and what maybe is happening now, and maybe what is happening in the future. So that what we need to do is that the older generation, particularly we have the Ogiek, for example, you have rightly put it, they were living in Mau forest. The Ogiek were saying, our homestead is the forest. We can find some people there, if maybe they're 80 years, 90 years, those are people who can tell us some history predating independence. So are we able, for example, getting that true history from those older people and record it and document it? So the onus is in this generation to start having meetings and having sittings with these particular groups of people so that we can be able to document, because if we don't document where they sit, some of them are illiterate and they might die with this library of information.
Yeah. And how do you think these stories shape the future?
The stories shape the future in that we can get the true history. Let me give you a good example. We have had a lot of post-election violence, particularly in Rift Valley, but premised on a wrong history. It's because some people take advantage of undocumented true history to spin certain narratives that some people believe is the true history. Because when we check, for example, how, for example, certain communities came to live in Rift Valley, there are certain communities who feel so much entitled to be in Rift Valley, and others, they treat them as foreigners. So if we can get the true history, how some people found themselves here. For example, let me give you a good example. In Joro here, there's a place called Ndefo. Do you know what Ndefo means? In full. Ndefo means Nakuru District X Freedom Fighters Organization. And therefore these are people, after independence, they were part of the Mau Mau struggle. After independence, they went to Jomo Kenyatta and asked Jomo Kenyatta, now we have got independence, where is our land? Because when they went to forest to fight for independence, unfortunately, the home guards, whom the Kikuus call Ngati, had already taken their farms, because the home guards were cooperating with the colonialists. So they came out of the forest, freedom fighters, landless. So, through the land buying companies, They had to buy some shares and got land in default. And they called themselves Nakuru District Ex-Freedom Fighters Organization. Therefore, do you know those guys have never had peace whenever we have post-election violence? What are we doing to such a generation? We are fighting a generation that their fathers and grandfathers brought us independence. Just because there's some weird thinking that Rift Valley belongs to certain communities. So when there is some political differences, we start bringing out some perceived land injustices. I'm calling it perceived because some of us mostly found ourselves here, but originally we were not here. As you have rightly put it, this was a land occupied majority by the Maasais. If you check, for example, Nakuru County or Nakuru District then, our first, the regional senator was a Luo, was called Wasonga Sijeyo. Why did Wasonga Sijeyo become a senator here during those days? There was no tribalism. There was no much attachment to some of these issues we are talking currently. The first member of parliament for Molo was a lawyer, Onamu. In fact, those days it was called Nakuru West. It was occupying the rest of the two Kuresois. Molo and Njoro was one constituency called Nakuru Town, Nakuru West. The first member of parliament for Nakuru Town was a Luo, Ochieng Oneko. I'm telling you this is because during those days, people knew very well Nakuru was a cosmopolitan area. So if we can go back to that history, one, it can help us set the record straight. Two, we can be able to tell the younger generation the true history about people who live here and how they came to live here. We can also be able to get true documentation about how these particular spaces and land was occupied. So this is very, very much crucial for future generations so that they are not baited by political narratives and propaganda, particularly for political persuasions.
And do you think that in future we can be able to create a space where these stories are documented in the right way and not, there's some stories that we do not know about. There's some stories that were left behind when we were studying. Do you think that we can actually get access to these stories, these real stories, and not only be sidelined to believe in one particular kind of story, but rather know the whole scope of the story? If we're talking about freedom fighters in the Mau Mau, if we're talking about people who helped us achieve independence, do you think that we can actually be able to create a space where every person who took part in the history of our country, can we be able to know and understand and also get access to this kind of information?
It can be done. This territory called Kenya, how did it come to be? After 1895, it was just a company, a British company. The territory called Kenya was a British company, British protectorate. And from there, so we need to come from there, document properly. Because, for example, I was in the US last year, and the first thing that they told me, first read our history. So I had to visit the museums. It's well documented. And everybody who did anything for the country, whether fighting for the independence or later building the nation, things are documented. So everybody is honored in their own right. That's what we need to do, because the current historical books that people write so that they are allowed by Kenya curriculum, I don't know, whatever, to be allowed to be used in schools, it was hide some skewed history. So this can be done because there is nothing that we lack. If, for example, there's a documentary that Hilary Ngweno used to run through Nation, The Making of a Nation, and it was a very, very good documentary. And if you check that documentary, it can form part of the history I'm talking about, because that one was never in our books when we were in school, and it's not even there. Yeah. So we have in our archives, we have historians. There are scattered information about our history. Can we get now historians and experts to collect and collate now a true history about Kenya? It can be done.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay.
Every landscape holds a story. The ones we read, the ones we dream about, and the ones we create. In order to tell a story that builds trust and meaningful connection, we have to understand the importance of landscape identity. And this was just the beginning of a remarkable journey of how stories interconnect with different narratives.